wasn't really understanding exactly what it was.
Well, you were trying to get inside.
Well, I thought I'd be able to get more, but then they only did it for like 5 minutes. Oh, I'll get it.
And
I don't think I've done a reading since midterm. I did all the readings up until the midterm.
But I paid $40 on ebook. So like, luckily I'm splitting it with my friend.
Okay,
Like,
word. Yeah.
you don't need it. So well, I was like, eh.
Sure. That's
Yeah, it was just something down there too.
it's amazing how much is happening. And it's just almost like how you.
I guess it's like that.
I was really honored that they were like, what is it?
Yeah. No, no, but yourself. Actually, bring into one of your students. Yeah. Immigration summit. Oh, is that? Oh, yes. Back to happy city. Oh, yes. So, yeah.
interesting.
All right. Just working on the house, working for CSDI.
All right, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us on a rainy Friday. A quick thing before we start, if I can just ask everyone to go to this URL on the board to just quickly sign in to this URL through your phone or your laptop. It just helps us get a sense of how many folks come and how much food to buy. So I'll just pause for a second, let people do that. Great. So the Smart Mobility Connection Series, SMC, the series where we invite faculty doing research with Attractive 21 to present on their work. And then this is an opportunity to get engagement and feedback from students, faculty, and community members. So we're very excited to have Steve join us today. Professor Quick is at the School of Architecture and has been working with Don Carter on study that we'll be presenting today on multimodal policies on regional corridors and small towns. And I'll let him sort of take it away from here. So please join me in welcoming.
Hi, everybody. This current project that I'm going to talk about is actually, we have just begun to work on it. So I'm going to use you as good feedback in terms of things that you think we could begin to look at as well as we delve into this project. We are also not fully funded yet. Been funded only 2 parts of it, which is only about half total funding, and still waiting for PennDOT to come through with a major grant, which will allow us to go beyond just mere data collection and into much kind of activity. But I'm going to give you a little bit of background as to why we got into this and the whole purpose of this research and how it all started. About 2-3 years ago, we contacted PennDOT to begin thinking about how, this is the Remake Cities Institute in the School of Architecture, about how we begin to think about our road systems and how we begin to think about how to design and integrate with those in the process. We started out with a case study working with the South Hills Economic Development Council group, who was actually looking at Route 51 as a corridor from the city on out to actually to large PA, a total of about 10 to 12 miles. And from the standpoint of what can be done about Route 51 as a corridor to make it a much more habitable place in the process. A lot of the initial thoughts were maybe we can begin to work this around transit-oriented development and begin to think about how corridors could begin to function differently in the process. In fact, Stephanie Daines here actually had started on this at one point and turned it over to me, but taking it fully without actually fully understanding what the scope of this study was going to be about. But as we got into the project, we began to look at all of the issues that corridor brings to the whole notion of transportation design. And what actually came out of this was a series of guidelines for the state of Pennsylvania. After we got well into working with the South Hills group, we began to understand that there's a lot of problems that are associated with corridors that we don't quite understand. A lot of things are not only what is the definition of a corridor, but how does the state begin to think about design controls or design guidelines for even how you design a corridor. And as we got further into it, we began to find, well, there aren't those kinds of answers. At that time, PennDOT was not actively involved in the project, but we were hoping that they would be. But once PennDOT came on, they wanted to take it from a localized study, corridors just on Route 51, but to use it as a case study to provide guidelines for corridors all across the state. In terms of research, we began really looking into, well, what is a corridor? And we found that they are not defined. Even though people talk about corridors, and there's a lot of information out there about case studies about corridors, about how people have designed corridors, and so on, no one really defined it. So we were kind of trying to look for this definition because we felt it was absolutely critical to how we began to understand these types of and frankly, we didn't come to this actual definition until about halfway through the PennDOT project. We started off with it by saying, okay, well, let's see how we might take this further, but found out that we needed that framework to begin to think about corridors in the broadest senses. It didn't go over well with the Route 51 communities because they thought we were doing a project for them. PennDOT doesn't, in a sense, provide research funds for projects. They do it for research. So we had to pull back a very strong civic engagement process, begin to focus on the whole notion of corridors for a transportation agency. Didn't go over well with the communities, simply because they felt that we were doing a planning project for them, and they didn't see how this broader scope was going to really affect them. In the end, it really does. However, they didn't see it that way, and so therefore, we had a lot of, frankly, very difficult issues with the community engagement process here simply because of this change in scope. And we had to turn the whole project upside down to look at it entirely differently. But what came out of this was really an understanding of what a corridor is. And we came up with the idea that there are really three types of corridors. There's an arterial corridor, a collector corridor, and a local corridor, but they have basically the same kind of functions, and they sort of derive on the same way. But if you think of a corridor as a series of different roadway types that are conglomerated together to get cars to move efficiently towards a destination. It may be a one-way destination from home to work, like such as from home to downtown, or it may be between two destinations, such as two different cities, or between two big, large gathering spots or destinations in an urban area. Could be from downtown area to a suburban shopping mall, all of these kinds of things. These are on local road systems. They're not on let's say, limited access highways. In other words, the freeways and parkways and so on. These do not apply to corridors. Corridors are actually city streets, suburban streets, and rural roads that connect to one another to move traffic efficiently. PennDOT's basic understanding and the way they approach corridors are to move the most amount of cars in the least amount of time with the least amount of obstructions in the process. We also found through this that the state mandates the speed limit on these corridors. Local communities do not have any say in this. It's purely state driven, and it is not based upon any sort of scientific fact, but on people's perception about how fast you should travel on the roadway. So it's based on the 85th percentile that if you just take that 85% of the people are going to travel this kind of speed, well, that becomes the speed limit on the roadway. What that doesn't take into account is there may be obstructions, there may be other kinds of things on this roadway and safety issues that say you shouldn't really travel that fast. But nonetheless, this is a state mandated kind of thing. So we, in working through this, we also began to understand that the state, even though they had a policy on multimodal transportation, and that's understanding that from all the way from mass transit down to the pedestrian, these are all forms of transportation. So a pedestrian is seen as a transportation vehicle, as well as a person on a bicycle, and so on in the way the state's policy means. And basically, when you begin to intermix all the modes in transportation, and particularly on a city street, moving at, let's say, 40 miles an hour, well, how do you accommodate pedestrians? How do you accommodate bicycles? And so on, let alone automobiles on that kind of thing, still move them efficiently at the same time. Well, that just led to a whole series of conflicts. Speed is a basic issue when it comes to safety, and that was actually very, very closely correlated. In fact, we found in research that the optimal speed to move the most number of people in the safest condition and get the most throughput is actually 27 to 28 miles an hour. It's not the 40-mile-an-hour speed. It's not 55-mile speed. And so right away it told us, number one, we need to begin to calm that down. Because if we can get a throughput still that's safer, and so on, and moves more people, well, maybe there's another solution to how we think about our corridors. The other thing that the state has is that on corridors, where they have these specified speed limits, you may not install traffic calming types of conditions, such as you could not change the roadway width. You could not begin to think about how you can make it safer for pedestrians to get across these kinds of things, and so on. It's all because the state wants to as fast as they can. So they see these as obstructions. Anything to slow down traffic is not, in sense of the way they think about it as an engineering solution. It's counter to the notion of how we begin to think about safety for pedestrians and bicycles. And so we found these conflicts in the process between state policy and actual reality situation. We also noticed that the state was not thinking about broader perspectives, such as climate control, climate conditions and so on, and change in climate, and was not being factored into the state's way of thinking about projects. So we got into the whole notion about adaptability design and beginning to think differently about how we really approach corridor-type projects.
When you talk about state policy, like, would that require the legislature to change it, or is it within PennDOT?
It's within PennDOT.
So they could change it if they wanted.
They could change it if they wanted. But the whole notion about climate action and so on was not being built into the project system. So not that we have the answers for that, but we just found that these were not at all taken into account when you begin to think about the holistic notion of multi-travel. So we brought these into our thinking in the process, and it was the first time that the state had actually looked at beginning to combine all these things into one package. What we came out with was a series of recommendations, and we followed the state's way in their design manual of beginning to think about not only the types of roadway systems that there are, and that's on the left-hand side, but also what their impact might be in terms of bicycle traffic and all the kinds of other things that would interplay into this, and about what types of actions might be taken on different roadways. We said, okay, we're going to work with the roadways that the state has already defined as their basis, and now how might we redefine them with a parallel set of guidelines that was equal to roadways, but just turned it into corridors. And we found that there were a lot of similarities between what's now existing and what we were proposing, but by introducing, be able to think of corridors and beginning to introduce the notion of traffic calming, other kinds of things, what might we do to change the guidelines for how you design these types of roadways? So this became the basis then for following through on the different types of programs that could be instituted in each of the different roadway types. So that after this chart, this was then taken into each one of the roadways in more definition, not only in terms of design, but also in terms of economic impact, environmental impact, as well as very detailed design impact, such as the width of lanes, the types of things you might do to calm traffic in these types of roads. This was presented to the state. I must say they have not done anything about it. I don't think they know how to do anything about it, because when I was in Harrisburg last August with Stan and the group talking about research and so on, there was absolutely deadpan reaction to presenting this study and to even what we were looking to do with this study. No reaction whatsoever from the state officials were there, no questions at all. And in fact, it only made it into a one-line report in the write-up of this research whole day. The state is interested really in technological answers to things, the widgets and the gadgets and the kinds of things that's going to help them with maintenance and so on, seem to take precedence over the whole notion of their policy of safe and efficient. So that didn't deter us, though. When the mobility challenge came around a year ago, we proposed taking another look at this corridors, because we really concentrated mostly on everything except the rural ones, which were on the left-hand side. We focused on suburban through urban. And those are frankly the easier ones to tackle. But we didn't quite know how to handle the rural road systems. So we put together a proposal to Mobility 21, and it was funded to begin to look at the rural impact, corridors impact on the rural communities. And so we had been thinking through this. We had some of the local people had an interest in what we were doing with the corridors. And we got a call from Susan Hawkenberry, who is with the Quaker Valley Council of Governments, about, I really want to do something about Route 65. Because Route 65, once you get outside the city, goes through a whole series of different municipalities, all the way from the city line out to Beaver County. And so if we began to think about how we thought about a corridor in a rural situation, how might we begin to tackle it differently, and might it change the kind of recommendations that we had made in findings? We also, through the Quaker Valley COG, made an approach to the State of Pennsylvania Department of Economic and Community Development, Economic Community, DCED, about funding for a civic engagement process as part of that. Because one of the things that we learned out of the Route 51 project, particularly the civic engagement aspect of it, is unless there is a really robust and good civic engagement process from the very beginning process, and everybody knows what the game is, it's going to result in a lot of chaos. So here we have the Council of Governments representing 13 to 14 municipalities on this route just to the city, the Allegheny County law, that we could begin to work with and think about what kind of intergovernmental mechanism might allow these 13 or 14 communities to begin to work as one voice, rather than 13 separate voices of which do not have very much power. But if they began to think collectively, they could do a lot more. There was also an interest on Beaver County COG, with about 7 or 8 more communities were also interested. It so happened that I had done some work for the person who was the chairperson of that COG on a planning project, and so there was this connection made. And so we then teamed together with the Quaker Valley COG as well as the Beaver County COG together and So now we have close to 20 communities now within the study, and it covers 2 counties rather than just the one. And it gives us a greater possibility in terms of looking at the different kinds of conditions on a corridor. We approached it though from a broader perspective than what we had originally done with the Route 1. We were beginning to look about the economic impact and the design impact a little slightly different way. And Lisa, when she put the title together on, or Chelsea, when she put the title together on this, is the economic impact on these small communities and how that might be translated into that. This is a great interest of the State Department of Economic Development. For them, it's to their benefit to see how economically the relationship between transportation and communities could be brought to leverage in a much better way in the process. So we built an economic aspect into this project in addition to design, in addition to the notion about how these communities might work together better. But we also were interested in the effects of automated autonomous. From the standpoint of how might we design our corridors, our roadways better to be able to make AVs see better. Not approach from putting all the emphasis on the vehicle designers and software, but beginning to see how the state can reciprocate that to create safer roadways for autonomous. 51 or 65 is a roadway which is having increased amount of truck. And everything is telling us from studies that Uber has done and others that the implementation of AVs is going to probably first through the semi-trucks and truck activity, freight activity, rather than through the adoption of individual cars. So particularly because right now there is a dearth of people to drive trucks. They're only meeting, I'm going to say, roughly 60% of the actual demand for drivers right now. And so therefore the adoption of AV trucks and freight is probably going to come faster. So and having been tailed by a truck on 65 while investigating this process, to have you at 40 miles an hour have a truck 10 to 15 feet behind you traveling that kind of speed is death-defying in a sense, and it's really darn scary. And the typical person on this, particularly when you have residential uses that are backing or driving out onto this corridor, we're just setting up for disaster process. So this became a real emphasis in terms of the AV aspect of this. We found an interest in teaming with a group called Aurora, who was an outgrowth of Carnegie Mellon, to begin to think about this broader perspective about how we begin to think about roadway design. So I'm going to, we were given the go-ahead on this project in February. It's now April. We are in a data gathering phase right now, and I'm going to tell you about that and what we found out so far. But we still have another year's worth to go with this project. So I would like to get some feedback from all of you after I present what I'm going to show you on thoughts that you might have that could help us expand and begin to think a little bit differently about this research. So I'd like to use it since
Excuse me, is that speed limits?
yes, these are speed limits.
Thank you.
And they range from 40 to 55 miles an hour on this basically 1-mile route. And there's a portion of it that I would call limited access highway in addition to just the normal roadway system. So these are 19 communities from Pittsburgh, which is on the right-hand side, starting with Bellevue, going all the way to Rochester in Beaver County, and communities that are involved. And they range all the way from bedroom communities to full-blown, regular, almost small cities with industry and commerce and so on, to ones that are semi, all of that kind of uses of mixes and so on. And we have also different corridor conditions in each one of these communities. So we were trying to find how can we begin to codify this and simplify it in terms of the research. So the idea of topologies here became very important to us on how we begin to approach them. So our initial thought in putting the proposal together, let's look at corridors that are either the main street in these communities, that parallel Main Street and are a competitor to Main Street, or completely bypass the municipal altogether. To understand the economic implications, but also the settlement pattern implications, and to begin to see whether or not there could be a transfer of wealth from those who are benefiting economically from the corridor to those that are not benefiting economically, to begin to think about how that wealth could be regenerated back into these communities to make them work. That's the kind of theory behind the thinking about that. So it takes a tremendous amount of cooperation to be able to do that, because why would somebody who is zoned for commercial all along a corridor even think about sharing the wealth of that? They get the taxes and so on with other communities who this may apply. The thing is, they're all on the corridor. They all share this route. They all share the problems of it, and so on. And so how? And it's really a different way of thinking, but it's the power of beginning to act as one, of where this whole thing has a possibility of even happening. PennDOT's extremely interested in talking to one set of clients rather than 20 different clients, because it makes their process entirely easier in the same way. So how can we take that desire and begin to think about how we actually create value? So the whole notion of how corridors can actually contribute to economic vitality or actually take away from it are all things that we're interested in. So this chart right here is just simply roughly the space between the communities is roughly the kind of actual distance is proportional. But on this little chart right here, it tells whether or not it's a main street, whether it parallels, whether it bypasses, and so on. But also tells us the speed limits, and we see quite a variety. Again, without the communities being able to say this is a speed limit, they can say. So, and what we did, we've driven the roadway, and these are the kind of conditions.
Why was economy different on there? The circle around economy borough?
Because economy actually does not touch, even though there's a very small section, it really has no real, the whole township is so far away
Okay.
from actually benefit. We have to, this is our first go through on this, it's got to go back and prove so on, but you're right, Stan, this kind of thing, and I know there's some issues with some of the definitions on here. These as we go forward. So this is in Bellevue, where we have a parallel condition to the main street. And this is what you think of as Route 65, where there's fast food restaurants and gas stations and so on, which are populating this route. And this is what the typical condition is throughout. However, it's not really the case. This is Bellevue. Let me go back. Yeah, this is still, this has actually been Van Avenue. But Bellevue is a residential community which has very large houses that all front onto 65, and this roadway goes right through the middle of that. Everybody has a driveway or curb cut onto the corridor. They are exiting from going to work and coming back, having to make left turns and so on off this fast road. I don't think I personally live there, but the houses are beautiful, the community is beautiful. It's probably the most scenic of all of the areas of 65. When we get to Kilbuck, which basically bypasses Kilbuck, and this is where Walmart wanted to put their new service center, and they had a big slide that really shut down 65 for several months because of soil conditions. You see this as basically a limited access highway. The speed limit here, though, is not 55 miles an hour. It's basically 40. So here, again, people travel this at 55 slopes. It's a great revenue generator, Kilbuck. But they used to do that, but they cut back quite a bit. I'm beginning to understand that. And then you have Glen Osborne as you drive Swiftly community, and you're beginning to see a little bit better planning in terms of the uses that are along the edge where you don't have curb cuts. You need to think about the grid of the local community as the best way to come to major points at which there are traffic signals and so on. Swiftly is not a partner in this because they're not a member of the COG. There's all kinds of issues with the COGs and the participation by communities because each has to contribute money into the COG for its governance. And if the city thinks they don't need it, they're not going to join. It's Swiftly High to do not, even though they have commerce on 65, particularly at their major intersection, as well as they compete with that on their main streets. But we go further west, and here's Leedsdale, and I'm going to show you two pictures of Leedsdale. On the left, between the highway or the corridor and the river, is basically just packed full of industry. So job creation is tremendous here. But on the right-hand side, we're beginning to see the same kind of small business activity we saw in Van Avon, just on the form of gas stations and McDonald's and so on. The same type of smaller activities are here as well. And then we get to Ambridge, and we get into more of a limited access, and the speed begins to increase. And as we go further out to Rochester, it was actually a 55-mile-an-hour speed. And the access into the main street, which is on the right-hand side, is down below. It's a full level below the level of the highway, and completely is missing. So we have all different kinds of road conditions, speed limits, all of these kinds of things which go to make up this. So we're going to have to probably add limited access highways into this corridor definition, because if we're seeing them on these kinds of routes, they should be sharp of what we do about it. What we started to do in the process of beginning to diagram these, and these are very simple diagrams, just meant to help us as a way to communicate amongst ourselves as we talk about the typologies that might exist. And here is a main street, type 1, where the corridor is the main street. Now, whether this is on, right, and with the river to the left, this is the Ohio River, and the railroad line on the edge, whether or not we have businesses on both sides here, or whether or not that's inboard further, it doesn't make any difference. The diagram is still the same. The commercial center of these communities is the corridor itself. The second type are those which parallel. And this is what we saw in Van Avon, one where Main Street acts like your typical small town Main Street, very walkable, very pleasant. Bicycles are encouraged and so on, tree-lined streets. But then you get down to the corridor, which is over here on the left-hand side, and you get the typical strip city and strip development that occurs with zoning and design controls are not actually imposed at all, or even part of the thing. They just want to increase the economic generation this kind of activity encourages. And then the last is where there's a complete bypass. Some of these of which the corridor has nothing to do at all with the township. This looks a little bit more closer, but in reality, the distance is actually much shorter. But there really is a true separation. So what we're also doing, in addition to the traffic understanding of what's happening on the roadway and uses and so on, we're also looking into each of the municipalities to understand what makes them tick. We want to understand what's the economic driver behind each one of these that makes it community on its own, that can exist without the help of other communities. In other words, what is its tax base, what are its uses, so on, and is it doing any sharing with any of the other municipalities? Of the 133 in Allegheny County, and I'm not sure how many there are in Beaver County, but everybody seems to want to operate independently when everything's pointing to it would be best to share resources. And what we're also doing with each of these towns is beginning to looking into the zoning. What is the zoning telling us? This happens to be 3 communities here of Avalon, Bellevue, and Ben Avon. The city line is right here going west to the left. Even though most of this is zoned commercial along the route, really what is happening and what are the effects? Even though zoning may not agree with the actual land use, we want to prove this to just see what's actually, to begin to understand these communities. So we're in the process of generating all this information. Right now it's data gathering. This will go on through the end of June. And we hope to get PennDOT financing by that time to really get into now how do we put this all together. So we are also looking at, in this case, the comprehensive plans that each one of these communities is required to submit to the state and how they portray themselves and what they see as their future plans as they look forward to how can we begin to take this information, again, to give us more background into the communities and how they function. Some of these are now undergoing the process, particularly those in Beaver County. Beaver County's looking at all of them together rather than individually. But here, what they found is that by teaming 3 to 4 or 2 together, it doesn't cost them as much money to produce the comprehensive as if they did it individually. So they've already begun to think about this process of working together. And the last component is the autonomous vehicles. And Aurora Innovations is our partner on this project, and they're donating in-kind services. And Aurora produces software to guide the vehicles. There's Carnegie Mellon robotics spinoff, and it so happens that chair of the board of the Quaker Valley COG also is a vice president with Aurora, so we were able to make this connection. And Aurora is donating his time and some others into this process. We are beginning to understand how AVs see. And this is going to continue much greater as we begin to get further into this. And this little cartoon begins to show some of the things that AVs are not. These are the unexpected things, things that happen quickly and are not mapped. There are also things that are obstructions to vision, which can be understand. So there are a whole series of events, and working with John Sebastian Fellows from Aurora, they have identified 17 that they use to begin to think about how they begin to categorize the data they receive, begin to map that data process. So John Sebastian has traveled the roadway and has put together this map as the first case going through, and the legend on the right begins to tell you the kinds of things that these AVs are not going to see. Driveway, parking lot, merge, significant side road occlusions, average above speed limit. Here's something where the AVs will not go above speed limit. Matter of fact, the biggest problem with accidents with AVs is being rear end as they're going too slow. But they will not break the speed. This is true of all AVs. So they are a hazard. Driving in perceptual areas of which the speed limit says you should go speed, but people actually go faster. They are actually hazard. Dense vegetation surrounding the road. This is something that's hard to control because if you get a fast-growing invasive species or something, it could cover over a road sign, it can block vision. So pretty quickly through a season. So there's seasonal changes that occur. Overpass and underpass, they're not good at understanding tunnels because they don't see the ceiling very well, and it blocks out the notion to have the corridor, which is basically right. Road geometry challenge, force lane merges, block traffic for left turns, challenging visibility, challenging road widths, and others. And you can begin to see that it's just not in the highly populated area. This occurs throughout the corridor. We don't quite understand what all of this means yet. What we're going to do is go to each of these locations and photograph it, begin to understand how we might think about changes to it. And so I'm going to leave you with one last slide here, just to show you sort of the approach we're beginning to think about is how we think about roadway design. And here's from an example of some of the complete streets type of thinking that's been going on in our urban areas about increasing visibility. And if we can begin to lengthen these bump outs, for example, at intersections, it not only provides a shorter distance for pedestrians to cross, but it also increases the visibility by the AV from, let's say, a tree, which may be an obstacle, or a parked car on that addition, so that people are crossing in a safe position. It also begins to ask, do we need to think about how we begin a much more robust separation of people and bicycles from moving traffic on these corridors as well, particularly if we're not going to lower the speed limits. Maybe we have to begin to think about alternative routes, not only for bicycle trails, but even if we have sidewalks on the corridors, we have to think differently about how sidewalks are done at the same time. So not only safety, but we're thinking about the aesthetic qualities of roadway design as well. How can we make this a very pleasant experience like we see in the Van Avon or the Bellevue area with the nice trees, the sycamores and so on, the very leafy green and ideal kind of community, but yet how do we make that safe and safe? So this is where we're going with this study. And this is my last slide, but this is telling you where we plan to go with this, some of the issues that we're getting to look at, and as we get further and as PennDOT comes into this process, we know that we're going to have to modify it slightly. They always have a way of working the contracts, but at least we know what we're looking at as we go forward with this and can then rebound it. So we allowed a lot of flexibility in this whole process to be able to change as we need to. So hopefully the PennDOT money will come through in the 1st of July when we finish this data collection for the mobility 21 cal to go into now the contract process. And actually, as we go forward with the city engagement process over the course of the summer with the DCED contract as well. So right now, data collection, as I mentioned, we still have 2 more months of this. We expect to get detail in that process. So I'd like to open it up for questions. Yes.
Yeah. In Conway, they have, I think, a train classification yard.
Yes.
Is that also intermodal?
Yes.
So do you get the railroad involved in it, because they're the ones that are putting a lot of trucks, so to speak, onto the highway?
I would like to, but the railroads do what they want to do. No, it's a matter of how we actually accommodate to this situation. There's a big switching. Yes, and we will be taking that into account. Likewise, with the trail systems, the Friends of the Riverfront is looking to expand from Chateau here in Pittsburgh all the way down to the Rachel Carson Trail and some of the others. And the issue, one of the things that Susan Hawkenberry was very interested in, we could take bicycles on California Avenue to the first 3 or 4 of these communities. But then the trail needs to switch to the others, the riverside, but there's no way to do that. So how might we begin to think about trails making this alternate connection, because we're seeing more and more that trails are becoming commuter routes. So if we think about trail systems as commuter routes, in addition to our street systems and so on, we begin to see a whole series of ways of moving people, thinking differently about our transportation systems. One thing I did forget to mention was in the first study, I began to understand the whole relationship between traffic planning, transportation planning, and how we design our cities. There is such a strong relationship between traffic speed and setbacks. If you think about suburban communities, you rarely see buildings built up to the beach. The traffic speeds are also higher, and what's happened as a safety kind of thing is that parking lots are located between the corridor and the buildings themselves. What does that do? It changes the land use pattern, but it also increases the speed. And as people move out to the suburbs, they want to lessen the commute time back into the city. So therefore, the faster they can get from their home into the urban environment, the better it is for everyone. At least that's the percent. So we get this land use because of traffic, transportation planning, it begins to affect our cities. And so this is quite an equation. The impact of this has really allowed suburbia to run up in a certain sense, and it's not driven by desire necessarily. It's a lot of it's driven by forces that are not in the general purview of certain designers.
Was there a safety analysis done on the corridor that you're using? Just, analyzing historic crashes or
Yeah.
fatalities,
Right,
or
we are.
especially with pedestrians or
Yes.
others.
We're collecting that information. We have GIS access to Allegheny County information, which has accidents in there. I still need to contact MDOT to get their local district. We do not have access to GIS information yet, and that's been a big holdup. We're trying to work through things there, but so at the moment, Beaver charges for its GIS information. It's not readily available. So once we get that, yes, we're releasing.
Great.
Yes, doesn't SPC have all of that?
Some of it. Lisa's over here nodding yes. It's something we have yet to really explore. Yes.
I wonder how you understand the at least very loud online backlash against bike lanes and multimodal sort of roads.
Yes. Actually, the thing is, they are state policy. The issue is how to make them safe. Part of the problem is that they're intermixed without the safety concerns taken. And we have that problem even in the city, as all the bike lanes are mandatory roadways. We not only get a backlash from people who say take a parking space, but you also decrease from 2 lanes down to 1 lane. So, where we began to see the answer to this, and we worked with SureTrack, robotics department, in adaptive signalization, beginning to time signalization such that how can you begin to time that so that you get a constant traffic. The big issues there, which what we also saw was people going off the corridor and into a neighborhood to bypass, because you can get around that. State's actually thinking ahead on that one to be able to put obstructions up to having swiftly, such as speed bumps and bumps, roundabouts, and all kinds of things. You're allowed to do that, but not on. So it's a combination. But yes, no, we're well aware of it. I look at it from a pleasant activity, as a commuter activity, but also more important safety. Really thinking about the bicycles. I've had friends who got injured just by a bus, even in the urban center. So yes, that's very much stuff.
It seems like working with all of these communities and not just PennDOT is a great opportunity to take a broader understanding of what a good corridor is.
Yes.
And I just wonder, it's also complicated because many of these communities don't define what they're looking for as clearly as PennDOT defines what it's looking for. That is, if your goal is simply to move cars faster and more efficiently, it's easy to say that, but if your goal is a better community, how does the corridor really support the community? I would think that if the objective is to make a better corridor in terms of livability and as well as the functionality of the street, then working with these communities to define those goals must be a big part of
Yes.
what you.
I probably didn't stress that enough. The whole notion about this is for, in the long run, for the communities to take over the control of design of these corridors. Give them the power to talk back to PennDOT to say, so that's really part of what we're looking at. Can we come up with a mechanism such that any activism can begin to. So I think it's on our part as researchers and working with the COGS, begin to introduce this idea even more strong as we get into the design portion of this. And that's a very good point, because you're right. We really should be looking about how to make these communities a little more livable, which was our original intention. Sometimes it gets a little lost when we find contracts out of what's what and so on, but not being subversive about it, but I think we need to be very upfront with the communities about how they can benefit from this. Otherwise, we will not continue with their support.
So, having worked at SPC for many years and seeing a lot of these planning initiatives go on, one of the things that I've seen a lot is that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what can happen and what can't happen in sort of the framework of how these decisions are made. So I'm curious about how you're going to build the education to kind of bring people to the same level of understanding to have those discussions. And when it comes to trying to bring all these different communities together to come up with a common focus and common goals, I kind of chuckled when you were talking about 51 because that's the area where I live, and it's very difficult to come to a consensus for about anything because you've got so many communities involved who all have their own interests that come first. So I'm curious how you see that happening so that you can come to a common vision.
Well, it was the Route 51 experience that actually wanted us to try to come at a different approach. And that's the reason why we models. And maybe probably that's a model here about how these communities can work together. Because on 51, we had the city, 4 neighborhoods, as well as the other neighborhoods and communities on that route. And the city doesn't talk to them, they don't talk to the city. And in fact, their communication even amongst them is not very good. We worked through the Southeast Economic Development Group, Frank Jones, but we found that they had pooled together to fund Greg's operation. But that was only a planning. He had no ability to actually, so he could only make solutions. Working through the COGS, we are working through the government, quasi-government. And I think we may have a greater chance of success. A little bit of a backstory about SPC, and I should talk to you further about this. We wanted to get funding through SPC project. SPC said no. This is not about transportation, about economic development. They were not. So you can see the tension.
Mm-hmm. But that's the whole reason SPC was created.
Absolutely.
SPRPC was limited transportation.
That's right.
They merged the real estate speculation into SPC with transportation, expanded it to 10 counties as the region's MPO. Now we had, prior to that, a citizen advisory panel process which I initiated back in the 90s that was region-wide, all 6 counties, gave you the things you're asking about having as far as public participation, where we had experts coming in as members who were residents and concerned individuals who would address these same sorts of things. Of course, you were roundly ignored entirely by the official of the quasi-governmental entity SPRPC. So when we reported falsifications that deliberately misallocated $12 billion of federal funds, that was 40% of everything that was coming into the region that was identified as necessary just to maintain what we had. That money was shifted into new capacity to open up and drive the suburban sprawl that you're talking about, deliberately, of course, pushed by the Allegheny Conference. The answer to our exposing that was to eliminate the Citizen Advisory Panel, which was region-wide, and replace it with 11 PPPs, with participation panels, which had limited membership that was selected by SBC and divided up citizen involvement so that there wasn't the crosstalk and the ability to work together. This is what you're dealing with.
And it's unfortunate, because really that is our transportation policy group for this region. And
it's the MPO.
That's right.
It has concurrence with PennDOT It's not PennDOT alone that makes this
That's right.
decision. It has concurrence with PennDOT and USDOT on the use of the federal funds. And the whole process is so perverted around this. We're not looking at a rail connection to the airport, which is big things in the regional, recent Amazon issue. That's not on the agenda. Instead, it's to continue the process of the agenda of real estate speculation and more sprawl.
Well, let me follow up with you on these particular issues. I think getting that history to understand that, and because I mean we're looking at another alternative to begin to bring that kind of activity back into at least on this 65, hoping that that can become a model for maybe taking things further. But by working through the FBOs and so on, it would be much better kind of process. So.
From Traffic 21's perspective, I think that's what's attractive about this project was the funding coming in from DCED specifically looking at the community process, you know, and the community engagement process and the economic development impacts side of it. That's what I think is going to make this project special because it's going to have a specific focus on economic development and on the community engagement separate from the traditional transportation process.
But it's actually very encouraging because Denny Duke, who is a local rep for
Right.
DCED, is very much on that. And in our very first civic engagement meeting we had, and he spoke up about the importance of this process. As opening it up to the communities involved, that hey, you now need to think about how you all work together in the process. We will help to try to get the mechanism to let that handle. It's got to be taken over to a citizen engagement type of procedure how to do these kinds of changes.
Great.
I think that's a great note to end on. We're about at 1 o'clock. Please give Steve Quick another round of applause. And feel free to linger a little bit if you had additional questions. Take any of the remaining food. This was the last SMC of the academic year. We'll resume in the fall, so please join us then. All right.
Thank you. Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks, Steve.
That was great.
Thanks, Chelsea. Thanks, Sam.
Said for
I will pay you soon.